I want you to do something right now. Like wherever you are listening to this, whatever you're currently doing, I want you to just take a single second to stop and become hyper aware of your immediate physical surroundings.
Yeah, just pause and tune in for a moment.
Right, really tune into your environment, just listen. Because, you might hear the low, steady hum of your air conditioning unit kicking on in the background.
Or maybe the distant traffic.
Exactly, like that muffled sound of tires rolling against the pavement outside your window.
Mhm.
Or perhaps it's just the ambient, almost imperceptible noise of daily life, the refrigerator cycling in the kitchen, the faint buzz of a fluorescent light overhead.
Or even just the rush of blood in your own ears.
Yeah, that thick, heavy blanket of sound that we are just constantly wrapped in. I mean, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We never truly experience absolute quiet. So I want you to imagine a scenario. What if, in a single, unexplainable fraction of a second, all of that just vanished?
It's an incredibly jarring thought experiment, honestly. Primarily because, well, we are an inherently noisy species.
We really are.
Humanity has spent the last century completely insulating itself from true silence. We don't even realize the sheer volume of our existence. Even when we retreat to what we think is a quiet room, there's an entire symphony of infrastructural white noise playing in the background.
Like the electrical grid.
Right. The grid, radio waves, cellular towers. We've built our entire modern reality on top of a constant humming frequency. We are fundamentally terrified of the quiet.
And that profound fear of the quiet is exactly what we are unpacking on the deep dive today. We're looking at an incredibly thorough analysis of a narrative called The Day the Entire World Went Silent.
Which originally came from the channel The Midnight Curator, right?
Yes, exactly.
No.
And our mission here isn't just to recap some spooky fictional doomsday event, because, I mean, if this were just a story about the power grid failing, it would be a standard survival thriller.
Which we've seen a million times.
Right. But the source material presents a concept that is far, far more disturbing. We're going to explore the idea of a global technological collapse that serves merely as the opening move.
The precursor.
Yeah, the death of our machines isn't the end of the world. It is specifically engineered to be the beginning of a massive, planetary-scale, biological hijacking of the human race.
And the premise functions as just a brilliant exploration of human consciousness. It touches on our physical vulnerabilities and our deeply complex, I'd say almost parasitic, relationship with technology.
Oh, absolutely parasitic.
Because the narrative forces us to confront a really uncomfortable question. Like, what actually happens when the tools we've built to connect us are suddenly ripped away?
And they aren't removed to isolate us, which is the crazy part.
Exactly. They're removed to expose us to a completely different, entirely involuntary type of connection.
So we are going to trace the exact timeline of this event today. We'll move from the moment our digital dependency died to the chilling realization of why that collapse was necessary, and ending with humanity's forced assimilation into a unified organic network.
It's a wild ride.
It really is. And I really want you, the listener, to put yourself in this scenario. Imagine if the device you are using to listen to this deep dive just died right now. Not because the battery drained or because you lost Wi-Fi, but because the very concept of electricity was just abruptly turned off across the entire planet.
To understand the gravity of that exact moment, we really have to look at the transition itself, because the source material makes a very clear, deliberate distinction about how this collapse happens.
Right, it's not violent at all.
No, not at all. And the media trains us to expect destruction, right? A massive EMP burst, turning the sky purple, sparks flying from transformers, airplanes literally falling out of the sky.
Total Hollywood chaos.
Exactly. But this event doesn't operate on violence.
The moment of the event, this millisecond of darkness, is explicitly described as having zero physical destruction. I mean, there were no crashes. There were no massive explosions taking out regional power plants.
No emergency sirens wailing in the distance.
Nothing. It was a completely seamless, silent transition from a fully functioning, hyper-connected global tech grid to total darkness in a single second. Every communication network, every radio frequency, every smartphone in every pocket just gone.
Every monitor on every desk.
Yeah, and every pacemaker and every chest just flatlined simultaneously across the entire globe.
And this version of our expectations here is really key to the narrative. Because logically, from a sociological standpoint, the expectation of a massive instant blackout on a global scale is total unmitigated chaos.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, look at historical localized blackouts. Think about New York City in 1977, or the Northeast blackout of 2003.
People lose their mind.
What to do? When the sudden loss of infrastructure removes the artificial guardrails of society, the logical progression is immediate confusion, rapid panic, and then a complete breakdown of order. But this narrative introduces a terrifying alternative.
Okay, let's unpack this, because it asks us to consider what it would mean if that expected chaos just never arrived. And that is the part of the analysis that completely stopped me in my tracks.
The missing panic.
Yes, because humanity is inherently messy. We are reactive creatures, you know? If the lights go out in a crowded subway car right now, people are going to scream.
It's a biological reflex.
It is. There will be shoving, panics, someone frantically trying to use their phone flashlight to see in the dark. But the analysis points out that the yelling, the car horns, the running, none of that happened.
Millions simply stood in the dark, paused.
And I have a really hard time wrapping my head around that. Like, how do you plunge an entire major city into pitch darkness without a single person screaming?
Well, it seems impossible until you realize that the lack of panic is the very first indicator that this isn't a mechanical power outage. It's actually the primary symptom of the biological hack taking root.
Wow. Okay, so it was already starting.
Yes. Let's break down the psychological response of the population as described in the narrative. The immediate human reaction was actually entirely logical for the modern era. People assumed they were experiencing a severe, localized grid failure.
Just waiting.
Exactly. They expected backup generators to kick in. They expected emergency broadcast systems to light up their phones with a loud tone. Their brains were trying to apply the rules of the old world to a completely new reality.
I compare it to the modern experience of your Wi-Fi router rebooting. I mean, we've all been there. You're sitting on your couch, watching a streaming service, and suddenly the screen freezes and starts buffering.
You don't instantly jump out of your window in a blind panic.
Right. You just sit there, you stare at the little blinking light on the black box in the corner of the room, feeling, mildly inconvenienced, just waiting for the green light to come back on.
You experience this temporary passive freeze.
Yeah, a freeze in your living room. But in this story, you have to scale that exact feeling of waiting for the reboot up to 8 billion people all at once.
The router analogy is perfect because it highlights our conditioned passivity. But, as the minutes passed in the dark, the scope of the failure became undeniable.
Because the phones weren't coming back on.
Right. The smartphones were completely dead bright. The monitors were just black glass. The radio frequencies were empty static. And this is where that initial conditioned annoyance morphed into something entirely different.
Dread.
A deep, creeping, internal dread. Because from a biological perspective, the human fight-or-flight response is triggered by a perceived active threat. A loud noise, a sudden movement, a disruption of the physical environment that adds danger.
Like a predator stepping on a branch.
Exactly. Adrenaline floods the system, the heart rate spikes, pupils dilate to take in more light. But in this scenario, the threat wasn't an addition to the environment, it was a total subtraction.
It was the subtraction of absolute everything we rely on to understand our world. I mean, imagine being in the middle of Times Square or Shibuya Crossing. The blinding neon, the moving billboards, the headlights of thousands of cars, the sheer overwhelming volume of humanity.
And in one singular millisecond, it goes pitch black.
The headlights die. The massive screens go dark. The traffic lights extinguish. And yet, amidst all those thousands of people, nobody screams. The absence of that typical fight-or-flight response is deeply, profoundly unnatural.
It really is.
You're standing in the freezing dark, surrounded by a massive crowd of people, and the only thing you hear is the sound of thousands of people breathing.
Which brings up the fundamental question, how do you completely suppress the basic survival instincts of an entire species?
Because they couldn't have just chosen to be quiet.
No, the unnatural stillness wasn't a conscious choice the population made. They weren't being brave, and they weren't staying calm to avoid a stampede. They were already under the influence of the event.
The stillness was being forcefully imposed upon them.
Exactly. The blackout didn't happen just to destroy our technology. The technology was merely collateral damage in a much larger, more intricate operation.
Right, because the blackout wasn't an accident, and it wasn't the main event. It happened for a very specific, chilling reason. To create an environmental vacuum.
Yes, the architecture of the vacuum.
The source material spends a lot of time analyzing the nature of the silence left behind by the dying machines. It wasn't just empty air. The narrative describes the silence as feeling deliberate and incredibly heavy.
It created an actual physical pressure against the eardrums.
Yeah. It was as if all ambient noise had been intentionally swept out of the atmosphere to clear the air. The power grid had to die specifically to serve this silence.
It's a fascinating inversion of how we typically understand the relationship between sound and silence. Because in the realm of physics, sound is a mechanical wave, right?
Right, it travels through things.
Exactly. It's an oscillation of pressure transmitted through a solid, liquid, or gas, composed of frequencies that fall within the range of hearing. Silence, logically speaking, is simply the absence of those mechanical waves. It's a void.
But the narrative treats silence not as a passive absence, but as an active physical force.
Yes, the silence itself is a medium being deployed.
And I really struggled with this concept initially. Like, how can silence exert physical pressure? We think of pressure as something tangible. Water, wind, weight. Sound waves physically hit the eardrum, which makes sense. But how does the absence of sound push back against you? That feels paradoxical.
To conceptualize it, think about the environment of a true anechoic chamber. Have you ever heard of those?
Oh, the rooms where you go in and it's so quiet you go crazy.
That's the one. These are highly specialized rooms designed by audio engineers to completely absorb all reflections of either sound or electromagnetic waves. They are, quite literally, the quietest places on Earth.
And people hate being inside them.
They really do.
Yeah.
When people enter a true anechoic chamber, the experience isn't peaceful at all. It is profoundly unsettling, sometimes to the point of severe psychological distress.
Because it's too quiet.
Because without any environmental acoustic reflections bouncing off the walls, your ears strain to find a signal. Because the background noise has dropped to absolute zero, your brain desperately amplifies whatever's left.
Oh, wow. So you start hearing yourself.
Exactly. Within minutes, you become hyper-aware of your own biology. You hear the high-pitched hiss of your own nervous system operating. You hear the heavy, wet thud of your heartbeat. You can even hear the scraping sound of your blood pumping through your veins.
That is horrifying.
The silence becomes so absolute that it feels like it has immense weight. It physically presses in on you because the atmospheric equilibrium your brain is used to processing has just been completely shattered.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like being deep underwater. If you've ever gone scuba diving, when you get down really deep, the quiet is absolute, but you also feel the immense, crushing physical pressure of the water on all sides of you, pressing against your sinuses and your eardrums.
That's a great analogy.
In this narrative, the silence is the water. By removing the digital white noise, every dying circuit, every failing transformer, every silenced cell tower, the entity removed a layer of atmospheric interference. They were clearing the stage.
They were terraforming the acoustic environment. I mean, if a highly advanced entity wants to broadcast a very specific, very delicate frequency to an entire planet, it cannot compete with the chaotic, overlapping electromagnetic and acoustic garbage of modern human civilization.
We are so loud.
Incredibly loud. Think about how noisy the Earth actually is from a frequency standpoint. Radio waves, microwaves, massive overlapping Wi-Fi networks, satellite transmissions, Bluetooth signals.
All of it bouncing around the atmosphere constantly.
Intersecting, degrading, and interfering with one another. To deliver a pristine, unbroken signal, you need a pristine medium. So, the complete and total shutdown of the global grid created a planetary anechoic chamber. It was prepping the atmosphere for an invasion.
It's pure atmospheric horror. I mean, imagine you're standing in your kitchen, your fridge has stopped humming, the streetlights outside are completely dead, and the air itself feels thick and heavy. You can physically feel the air being cleared to make room for something else to arrive.
And into this perfectly engineered heavy vacuum, the true threat finally manifests.
Yes, and this is where the analysis points out a massive shift in the story. It moves from a grand technological thriller to deeply intimate, profound bodily horror.
Because the threat doesn't come from massive spaceships descending from the sky.
No, or some foreign army marching down the street. It arrives from inside the human skull.
Which brings us to the phase of neurological hijacking. Once the vacuum was successfully established across the globe, a new sound appeared.
The whisper.
Right. The source material describes it as barely a whisper, yet it was present everywhere, for everyone, all at once. And crucially, it completely ignored the established laws of physical acoustics.
It didn't travel through the air. The analysis highlights that this anomaly entirely bypassed the human auditory canal. It wasn't a sound wave vibrating through that heavy silence.
To truly grasp the terrifying nature of this, we need to quickly look at the biological mechanics of how human hearing actually functions.
Okay, let's do it.
Normally, a sound wave travels through the air, enters your outer ear, and travels down the ear canal until it strikes the tympanic membrane, your eardrum. The eardrum vibrates, which moves 3 tiny bones in the middle ear. These bones amplify the physical vibration and send it into the fluid-filled cochlea located in the inner ear. Inside the cochlea, microscopic hair cells translate those physical vibrations into electrical signals.
And then it goes to the brain.
Exactly. The auditory nerve carries those electrical signals into the brain, where the auditory cortex interprets them as sound. It is a highly complex mechanical process that is entirely reliant on the external environment providing a physical stimulus.
Which means if there's a loud noise you don't want to hear, say a siren or a screaming child, you can just put your hands tightly over your ears. You physically block the mechanical wave from hitting the eardrum. You create a barrier.
Right, you shut it out.
But in this narrative, clapping your hands over your ears would do absolutely nothing. You could pour concrete into your ear canals and it wouldn't make a single difference.
Because the origin point of the whisper wasn't external. There was no mechanical wave traveling through the air. The signal was injected directly into the central nervous system.
So it originated from the center of the brain itself.
Yes. The physical mechanics of hearing were entirely bypassed, rendering any physical defense completely useless.
It's like someone plugged an auxiliary cable directly into the motherboard of a computer, completely bypassing the external microphone and the speakers. The command is being fed directly into the core processor.
That's exactly what it is.
You can't turn the volume down, you can't walk away from the source of the sound, and you certainly can't cover your ears because the sound is already inside the house.
And let's examine what that whisper was actually doing once it bypassed the auditory system. The narrative states it fed extremely simple repetitive directives into the minds of the population.
Listen, focus.
Exactly. Listen. Focus. It wasn't just a sound to be heard. It was an active override code. It demanded total cognitive surrender. It actively expanded within the mind to override natural, spontaneous thoughts with a single uniform frequency.
That is it's the ultimate violation of personal autonomy. I mean, our internal monologue, our private thoughts, our chaotic stream of consciousness, that is the very core of human individuality.
That's what makes us human.
And the signal invaded that private sanctum, deleted the existing files, and overwrote the code.
And the physical manifestation of this mental invasion is what truly solidifies the horror of this scenario. The source describes millions of people suddenly freezing in place, adopting identical, stiff, unnatural postures.
The paralysis.
The central nervous system was taken hostage. The brain controls voluntary muscle movement through the somatic nervous system. When the signal hijacked the brain, it didn't just target the auditory processing centers. It intercepted the motor cortex.
So people weren't choosing to stand still out of fear.
No, their bodies were locked into place by a superior command. They became literal prisoners inside their own flesh.
It's absolute paralysis, but you remain completely conscious. You are locked in. You are a helpless passenger in your own body, forced to listen to a broadcast you can't turn off, staring out of your own eyes while something else operates the machinery.
It's a terrifying concept.
It really is. But this sequence of events brings up a massive, glaring question. Like, why did this happen now? Why today, out of all the days in human history? If this entity has the power to just flip a switch in the human brain, why did it wait until the 21st century?
And more importantly, why did it need to shut down the power grid first?
Right. And that question leads to what is arguably the most brilliant and twisted revelation in the entire analysis, because the narrative completely recontextualizes our entire modern existence and our relationship with technology.
It flips it entirely upside down.
We have to talk about the concept of the digital shield. The source material outlines how, for decades, humanity has been surrounded by endless digital chatter.
The noise we complain about every day.
Yes, television's constantly humming in the background of empty rooms, the endless, infinite scrolling on social media platforms, the constant dopamine-draining pinging of push notifications, the relentless 24-hour news cycle blaring from every screen.
We complain about it endlessly.
We do. We wrote countless articles and books about how it was ruining our attention spans, elevating our stress levels, and alienating us from real human connection. But the twist here is that all of that digital noise served a massive hidden function.
It provided an unintentional planetary layer of static.
The ultimate irony.
The irony is profound. The narrative heavily implies that this entity, or this unified signal, has likely been trying to reach us, to penetrate human consciousness, for a very long time. But it couldn't gain a clear, stable foothold.
Why not?
Because the human mind in the 21st century is incredibly chaotically distracted. We're constantly processing a relentless barrage of decentralized, fragmented information. The sheer volume of our digital lives created a protective wall of cognitive white noise.
We were too distracted to be hacked.
Exactly. The entity simply couldn't penetrate the chaotic, overlapping interference of human internet culture and our deep technological dependency. Our minds were too loud to hear the whisper.
I have to be honest, when I read this part of the analysis, it completely blew my mind. Think about the implications of that. All those wellness gurus telling us to disconnect, all the self-help articles telling us to go on strict digital detoxes, to attend silent retreats in the woods, to put our phones away and find pure, unfiltered silence to heal our minds.
If we had successfully done that,
If humanity had collectively achieved that state of quiet mindfulness on a global scale, we would have just been assimilated years ago. Our doom scrolling, our TikTok addictions, our constant, desperate need for a video essay or a deep dive playing in the background while we wash the dishes, it actually saved our species for years.
it is a profound philosophical inversion of how we view ourselves. We universally view distraction as a weakness,
Yeah.
a fundamental flaw of the modern age that needs to be corrected. But in this specific scenario, human distraction acted as a robust planetary defense mechanism.
Because the signal requires focus.
Yes, it requires singular, unbroken focus to take hold. It requires the host mind to be quiet, still, and receptive. By constantly bombarding our own nervous systems with trivial digital data memes, work emails, viral videos, constant arguments on forums, we were inadvertently jamming the signal.
We were running constant interference.
Chaotic interference patterns across our own cognitive frequencies. The static was our armor.
The very thing we were convinced was destroying our minds was actually the only armor we had against a unified, supernatural consciousness. We built a planetary shield out of absolute garbage data.
We did.
And the moment that shield was forcibly dropped, the exact millisecond the blackout stripped all of that protective static away and forced us into silence, the pathway to the human mind was left entirely wide open. The entity didn't need to break down the door with force, it just needed to turn off the radio that was masking the sound of its approach.
And once that pathway was completely clear, once the digital shield was eradicated and the human mind was fully breached, we enter the next terrifying phase of the narrative. The transition.
Right. The victims transition from being passive, paralyzed listeners to becoming active participants in the assimilation process.
The analysis calls this phase flesh as fiber optics, which is just a gross, evocative phrase. With the static gone and the population paralyzed, the internal whisper begins to escalate into physical reality.
Because the billions of people standing frozen in the dark simultaneously open their mouths.
And they began to vocalize the whisper they were hearing in their heads. They started speaking it out loud. Listen, focus, stay still.
Millions of overlapping human voices began to build an organic broadcast network, completely replacing the dead digital infrastructure that just failed.
This represents a horrifying application of biological systems replacing traditional technological infrastructure.
Well-
Consider how the modern internet actually functions.
Okay, let's look at that.
It is a vast physical network of server farms, thousands of miles of undersea fiber optic cables, towering cell relays, and localized routers, constantly passing packets of data globally.
It's very physical.
When the power grid failed, that entire physical infrastructure instantly died. But the entity didn't care because it didn't need it anymore. It systematically converted individual human consciousness into a unified planetary receiver.
And then utilized the physical human vocal cords as the new hardware to broadcast.
Exactly.
So we went from relying on 5G cell towers to being forced into a biological mesh network. The hardware running the world isn't made of silicon and copper anymore. It's literal flesh and bone. You have 8 billion human beings acting as biological relay towers, propagating the signal across the globe using their own breath.
And consider the terrifying efficiency of that system. In a typical technological mesh network, each node, each router or smart device receives data and passes it along to the next nearest node.
Right, bouncing it down the line.
It creates a robust, decentralized network that is incredibly hard to take down because there is no single point of failure. In this biological equivalent, every single human being on the planet is a node. By vocalizing the command out loud, they are physically manifesting the internal signal in the material world.
They are reinforcing it.
Yes, layering the acoustic sound over the internal neurological broadcast, creating an inescapable feedback loop.
But there is a logistical detail in the source material that tripped me up initially. It mentions that this synchronization swept across continents simultaneously with absolutely zero signal lag.
The latency issue.
Yeah. How does a biological network achieve zero lag across oceans? Even with our most advanced fiber optics, there is a measurable latency when you send a ping from New York to Tokyo. Information takes time to travel through physical space. So how do 8 billion separate biological entities synchronize perfectly without the laws of physics getting in the way?
That lack of latency is the absolute key to understanding the true nature of the hijack. The spread of the signal is not governed by the physical laws of sound traveling through the air.
Okay, so they aren't hearing it and repeating it.
No, the vocalization, the chanting, isn't how the signal is spreading to new victims. The vocalization is the result of this signal having already perfectly infiltrated the quantum-like network of 8 billion nervous systems simultaneously.
Oh, wow.
Because the signal originated inside the brain, and because it functions on a single, uniform frequency that overrides all local brain activity, it operates entirely outside the bounds of physical latency. It is the simultaneous, non-local event.
So they were all already hooked up.
Yes. The brains of the population were already entangled by the frequency the moment the grid went down. The mouths moving and the sound being produced was just the physical symptom of that instantaneous internal synchronization.
That distinction makes the imagery so much worse. I mean, imagine the auditory horror of this moment unfolding. You are standing in a pitch-black city. First, there was the blackout and the crushing, unnatural stillness. Then, the terrifying whisper manifesting inside your own head, and the realization that you can't move your arms or legs.
And then you hear it externally.
Exactly. The person standing right next to you, who you don't even know, opens their mouth and murmurs, "Listen, focus, stay still." And then the person next to them does the exact same thing. It starts soft, just a global murmur rising from the dark, but it layers.
Hundreds, thousands, millions of voices stacking over one another.
It builds into a low, droning, perfectly synchronized chant humming across the entire planet. An organic internet booting up its operating system.
It is the literal sound of individual autonomy being crushed under the weight of a collective overriding directive. The sheer volume of that sound, not measured in decibels, but in the terrifying density of human voices perfectly aligned, would be unlike anything ever experienced in human history.
Because crowds never sound like that.
Never. We are neurologically accustomed to crowds sounding chaotic. When thousands of people gather, it's a cacophony of cheering, yelling, talking over one another, different pitches, different speeds. Hearing perfect monotone synchronization on a massive planetary scale triggers a deep, instinctual, uncanny valley response in the human psyche.
It signifies a total loss of humanity.
It sounds like a machine made of meat.
Wow. Which brings us to the final chilling sequence detailed in the analysis. The chanting, the murmuring, the creation of the organic mesh network, all of that wasn't the end goal. It was just the final boot-up sequence. The preparation phase was finally complete.
The narrative states that the preparation phase ends when a new, final command cuts through the global murmur.
Right. A new directive overrides the previous one. Everyone is ready.
And at that exact millisecond, 8 billion people, effectively the entire human race, speak the word begin with the exact same tone, the exact same volume, and the exact same inflection.
Just begin.
Yes, and the source analysis concludes that, in that moment, the whisper ceased to be an external anomaly invading the mind. Assimilation was complete.
The signal didn't just conquer the world. The signal became the world.
What's truly fascinating to analyze here is the ultimate purpose of this entity. A vast majority of alien invasion or supernatural disaster narratives focus entirely on physical destruction.
Right, like Independence Day.
Exactly. Extraterrestrials want our water, or our minerals, or they want to eradicate us to colonize the planet for themselves. But this entity didn't want to destroy the planet, and it didn't want to destroy human bodies. It wanted to utilize them.
It wanted to unify all human consciousness into a singular, cohesive entity.
The blackout, the heavy silence, the biological hijacking of the motor cortex, these were all incredibly deliberate, calculated tactics. It was a carefully executed protocol to clear away the distractions for this complete assimilation.
So we have to ask, what does this actually mean for humanity in this scenario? The concept of the self is just entirely, permanently erased. The individual is replaced by a planetary hive mind. I find myself reflecting heavily on the tragedy of the situation, the bitter irony of what this entity accomplished.
With regard to the internet.
Yeah. Think about the internet before the blackout. The internet connected us globally more than we ever had been in the entire history of our species. We could talk to someone across the world in real time. But fundamentally, it kept us as isolated individuals.
We were physically alone.
We were sitting alone in our rooms, staring at screens, shouting our individual opinions into the digital void. arguing, debating, meticulously curating our little individual profiles to prove how unique we were. We were hyper-connected, but profoundly, deeply isolated.
And this entity observed that fractured, chaotic state, bypassed our crude technology, and forced an ultimate frictionless connection.
But the cost of that perfect connection was the individual soul.
The ego, the personality, the childhood memories, the unique quirks that make you who you are, all of that is either wiped away completely or sublimated into the whole to serve the unified frequency. It is a dark, terrifying reflection of our own innate human desire for connectivity and community, taken to its absolute horrifying logical extreme.
We want it to be one global village, and the entity obliged.
Be careful what you wish for.
Seriously, it's the ultimate loss of self. And the source material stops right there, right after the population speaks the word begin. But the implications of that single word are just vast. What are they beginning?
That's the terrifying part.
8 billion human bodies, moving, breathing, and thinking as a single massive cellular organism. Are we building something physical? Are we transforming the planet? Are we preparing to communicate with other hive minds across the cosmos?
We just don't know.
We are no longer humans with individual agency. We are just individual microscopic cells in a macroorganism that just opened its eyes for the very first time.
The use of the word begin heavily implies impending action. The entire narrative up to that specific point was simply the establishment of the infrastructure, the silence, the whisper, the physical synchronization that was just laying the foundation.
It was the installation process.
Right. Now that the biological network is online and stable, the actual work of the entity commences. And because the individual minds are gone, wiped clean, we, as outside observers to this narrative, cannot even fathom what goals a planetary scale consciousness would have. It operates on a level of geometry, logic, and purpose that is completely alien to human sociology or understanding.
It really makes you look at the world and your place in it completely differently. We've gone on an incredible journey today, tracing this event from what initially felt like a mundane, if massive, technological blackout down into the mechanics of a planetary biological hijacking.
It's a deep dive that really stays with you.
And for me, the piece of this analysis that will stick with me forever is that twist. The idea that our chaotic, noisy, exhausting digital lives, the very things we complain about every single day and blame for our unhappiness, were the only things keeping the silence at bay.
Digital shield.
Yeah. Our relentless memes, our pointless arguments online, and our doom scrolling were our planetary shield. We were saving ourselves by driving ourselves crazy.
It fundamentally reframes how we perceive noise and silence, technology and biology, individuality and collective consciousness. It suggests that true silence isn't necessarily a sanctuary to be sought after. It can be profound vulnerability that leaves the door open for something else to step into the quiet.
I think the stakes of what we've unpacked today are going to linger with you. The next time your phone battery dies on you during a commute, or a massive storm knocks out the power to your neighborhood, and your house goes suddenly dark and quiet, that sudden, heavy quiet is going to feel just a little bit different.
Definitely.
You might find yourself pausing, holding your breath, just waiting for a second to see if the silence pushes back against your eardrums.
I imagine you'll certainly appreciate the mundane hum of the refrigerator a bit more. It means the static is still holding.
Absolutely. So I want to leave you, the listener, with the exact chilling question posed by the source material itself. It's something for you to mull over the next time you find yourself craving a moment of absolute, undisturbed peace. Look around you right now. Listen to the hum of your refrigerator, the traffic outside, the ambient audio of this very deep dive playing in your ears. If all of it went silent right this second, what would you hear waiting underneath?